Hey, it's the Magnificent One here. Some people have been talking lately about how manga has somewhat disrupted the industry and, in fact, taken over the comic book industry. And, that's true, right? Japan gives us the best of the best when it comes to manga. So they definitely supersede what the traditional superhero comics are doing in the US, right? So, what can we do from this? What can we learn from manga that maybe we can apply or just steal directly from what they're doing into U.S. comic books. I think there's a couple of things here, some thoughts and some ideas. Number one, what you'll notice is comic books now are primarily sold in comic book shops, and those are far and few in between, and they're becoming less and less relevant and prevalent. And one of the things is when you go into comic book shops now, a lot of times they're not making their money selling comics. They are, in fact, making their money selling, Funko Pops and video games and all kinds of different paraphernalia, but not necessarily comic books. So it's just something that's kind of not gonna work, especially if you're trying to expand the market, right? So in Japan, manga is everywhere. It's in every type of store. You go to, if you're on a train, they sell manga directly on the trains. If you go to basically any shop, they're available, right? I started off buying comic books from Walmart. It was actually, it's actually pretty incredible back then when I was a kid. You're talking the late 80s, early 90s, how big of a comic book section some of these Walmarts had, right? Like you'd go in there and they'd have every new issue of the major publishers, DC and Marvel. And that's gone now, right? You used to be able to go in the gas stations and buy them off the spinner rack. But now that stuff's all gone. I remember I bought like all my Wolverines like strictly from Walmart. All my X-Men strictly from Walmart. I never missed an issue. They always had them, right? So that's gone though. So when you do something like that, it's tough to just have an expectation that people are going to go into a very niche and specific type of store to buy a product. It's just not. It's not plausible, right? Because what you end up with is you end up with people who are either going in there because they've always gone to comic book shops, so those would be your traditional customers, or you're getting people who basically are buying in the periphery. What I mean by that is they're getting comic books off of like Amazon or some sort of reseller of comic books online and not actually going in there. But again, they're not generally exposing themselves to new comics, and the comic books themselves are not getting out to new readers. So that's probably the big thing, is somehow figure out a better distribution system. So the industry does have to change like that. I don't know if that's getting into bookstores, not comic book stores, but actual bookstores, and just having a bigger presence than they do now, or if it is trying to reevaluate if we should get into the Walmarts or to the gas stations of the world. But one of the things is now is the market might already be gone, so there might not be any interest whatsoever. So then it's one hell of an endeavor to try and malign the business model to try and get comic books out, right? So the other thing about it too is probably lesson number 2 from manga versus superhero comics is the purity of the universe. And what I mean by that is if you read a long run of a manga comic, it's kind of self-contained. The characters stay within that universe, and there is a story that exists that continuously supports the characters within that universe. So there's not a lot of crossovers between mangas. It does happen on occasion, but essentially you can read one solid run of a book and it stays with generally the same people, the same plot, and that's all you need to read. Superhero comics are very, very all over the place, and there's crossovers every year, every couple of years, I should say. Actually, nowadays, probably every year, right? And it feels like you can't just read a book. You've got to read many books to pick up the full story. So there's no self-encapsulated story that is just pure by itself. The universe is a mixture of different things. If you want to read Wolverine. Well, Wolverine has gone through many iterations, and then he also goes through. He's part of the X-Men, the Uncanny X-Men, X-Force. He's all over the place, and so now the reader has to jump back and forth to get the full story. And it's a little thing, but it gets frustrating. That's actually, I mean, I've kind of dropped the X books. I picked it up back a little bit with Powers of X, House of X, but I probably almost read all of those issues. I read as much as I could pick up and find, but there were a couple of issues I think I missed here and there. But I got the gist of the story. But again, after that, it started to cross over into multiple different books and different plots and all kinds of stuff. But this is a problem that goes probably back to the 90s, where they just started doing crossovers. And people, the problem was you could not get the whole story of a book by reading just one title. When there was the crossover where... what was the one where Magneto or Professor X became the bad guy? I can't even think of it anymore. But in any case, I remember reading like a series, and then suddenly it was interrupted. And then if you didn't read they'd say these things like continued in X Factor 275 or continued into something random like Punisher 18. And if you didn't pick up that issue, the next issue of the series you were reading sometimes were completely different. Probably the greatest example of that was there was this series, and Brian Michael Bendis, you either love him or hate him, but there was a series, the New Avengers, and like the first 15, 20 issues, it's decent. It's got a storyline. It's got the biggest stars in there: Spider-Man, Power Man, Iron Man. But then, like, I didn't read the crossover event, and that just stopped. Like, basically, they're like, oh, by the way, the Spider-Woman was a Skrull, and there is no New Avengers. And I was like, what happened to the story? What happened to the series I was reading? Now it's completely different. And so I just stopped reading it because I was like, I don't know what the hell happened. I'm not going to go and buy a bunch of different books because first of all, I don't like this whole Skrull thing. I just wasn't into it. So I just didn't buy the event, and then now I'm lost. So manga doesn't do that. Manga, it's like, okay, if you read a series, well, I mean, generally, the story's in the series. You don't have to jump around and go somewhere else. So the other thing about another lesson we could probably learn from manga is the amount of pages that you get for a book, right? It's cheaper. It's as simple as it sounds. It's just cheaper to buy a manga book than it is a U.S. superhero comic book. And when I say the amount of pages, it's not like page count, but it's storytelling. So we've gotten this thing now where basically in U.S. comics, it's decompressed storytelling. Something that during the Claremont era would take like 2 issues now takes like 20, and then stuff gets lost. So there's all these little plot lines that start, and then the creative team changes, and they never get picked up. They never get concluded. And then stuff just gets drawn out longer and longer and longer. It's frustrating. Whereas with manga, you may have some of that in the background, but generally you have pieces of a plot that tend to get concluded quicker. So they might have a long, epic storyline, like a theme, but they are generally wrapping up these sub-stories pretty quickly, which is kind of nice. I still go back to Jim Shooter's his approach, which is kind of have a story that is self-contained within the issue, have a second story that spans over 3 or 4 issues, and then have an ongoing story. So that way everybody comes in, reads a book, and they get some sort of conclusion while also getting a cliffhanger of sorts, right? So that's always nice. And then the real nice thing about like that 3 or 4 issue arc is if you come into it and you obviously have the conclusion of that single issue story, you only have to go back like 2 or 3 issues to get the rest of that second story, right? So it's a good starting point. and encourage you to collect, not by trying to get you to collect the whole series, but maybe having you collect 2 or 3 issues, right? So I think when we look at that, it's great because compressed storytelling, or at least well-paced storytelling, keeps people interested, right? Because if you have more story, the more involved you will get as a reader. So you want to keep reading. You have a vested interest in the characters themselves. Whereas if you are just picking up 22 pages of filler, you don't care, And so there's that. The other thing is to, for the most part, creative teams, and so take this with a grain of salt. But with manga, the big names with creative teams tend to be the same. Obviously, they have a lot of assistants, and they probably go through those like crazy because they don't get paid very well. But for the most part, it's consistent. The leaders, for lack of a better term, of a book tend to stay the same with a creative team. Whereas in Marvel and DC, man, good luck. I don't even, if you were to mention the name of writers or artists today, I probably wouldn't be able to name them. It's because there's not a lot of consistency. They may do a 5-issue run. Dude, that's nothing. What about a 25-issue run? What about a 50-issue run? That's where we get to know writers. That's where you get that consistency of product. And I just wish we would, keep those same writers on there. Keep those same artists drawing the same books, because that's really how they develop anyhow. But that would be kind of nice. The other thing too is with manga, there's a lot of cultural penetration in that everybody reads them. And there's stories for everybody. In the U.S., we've tended to create superhero stories, right? And those are awesome sometimes, and sometimes they suck. But what we're trying to do is, on occasion, we try to take established genres, which is superhero, big ripped dudes and skinny waisted, big breasted women in costumes fighting evil villains. And instead of keeping the purity of that, we take that genre and then we try to mix in other elements. So you start getting into, storylines about feminism and politics and LGBTQ plus, and those are all fine, but why not just make series about those and sell them to a particular market instead of taking an established superhero market and then just overlapping them with those elements? It's incongruent. It's not why people picked up those books in the first place, right? So it's knowing your audience, right? And I think finally the last thing is integration and advertising. So manga and anime a lot of times have a pretty close overlap in that if something's going on with an anime based in the manga, you can almost read ahead in the manga and kind of see what's going to happen, and it sparks an interest for our viewers and readers. And there's also a lot of advertising of it too. When's the last time you saw a comic book advertisement, right? They might run a YouTube channel, they might do something in one of these periphery sites, but you just don't see it in a way that's, effective, right? And actually, one other note I would say is covers. Anime covers, man, they're pretty cool most of the time. They're attention grabbing, they're sexy, they're violent. They do a lot of cool stuff. Whereas I don't know if I've seen a great cover from Marvel or DC for a long time. There's some elements which are pretty cool, but man, it's been a while since you've seen something that's eye-catching, right? So I think this shouldn't be a wake-up call, but it should be a reminder that American comics used to be great. Why don't we go back and try to capture that greatness again? And maybe one day we'll end up going to Japan and dominating their market, right? Anyhow, let me know your thoughts. And these are just my opinions, so I could be completely off base here, but I appreciate you guys listening. Bye.